If you've ever done something the right way, quietly, while everyone around you moved on to something faster and felt a little foolish for it, even while part of you still believed you were right, this story is for you. It's about two people under one roof, pulling in different directions for reasons that both made sense. The answer isn't what you'd expect. Here's where it begins. By the second week of September, one sentence was moving through Oakridge County faster than the frost warnings. Something about a woman out past the county road, driving cedar poles into bare dirt for no reason anyone could explain. Alice Bennett heard it secondhand from her own husband, repeated without much malice and without much conviction either. The way a man repeats something he isn't sure he believes, but hasn't decided to argue against. She kept driving the poles in any way. One a week, sometimes less. If you'd asked her why, standing there with dirt under her nails and the light going long behind her, she might not have had an answer that satisfied anyone but her. The orchard had lost 11 young trees to root damage since June. Not the old trees. Their roots ran too deep for it to matter. But the new plantings, the ones meant to replace the row Harold's father had cleared out for firewood 2 winters back. Something was working under the soil at night, girdling the bark just below ground level. Quiet work. By the time the leaves yellowed, it was already too late to save what was underneath. Harold found the 10th one first. A Tuesday morning, frost still on the grass. He didn't say much about it. He stood over the small collapsed trunk a long while, hat pushed back, hands in his pockets. Then he went inside and came out 20 minutes later with a paper sack of bait pellets he'd bought 3 towns over, the kind with a warning label longer than the instructions printed beside it. Alice remembered something different. Her father used to say a farm with no hawks on it was a farm feeding something else instead. A few dead cedar poles, driven upright at the field edges, would give a hunting bird somewhere to sit and watch from. Not overnight, not even in the first month. But a barn owl could take 60 mice in a season without anyone lifting a hand, and a red-tailed hawk didn't much care whether the thing it caught was called a pest by the people who owned the field. She could still see her father doing it, if she let herself. Late in his life, past 70, walking his own fence line with a coffee can of nails in one hand and a scrap of cedar in the other, never in a hurry about it. He hadn't called it anything special. He'd called it giving the hawks somewhere honest to sit, said it the same flat way he talked about mending a gate or oiling a hinge, as if it were simply one more chore among the rest, not a belief at all. Alice had been maybe 9 the first time she asked him why he bothered. He'd shrugged and said the birds had been doing this work a lot longer than any man with a spray can, and it seemed only decent to give them a place to stand while they did it. She didn't say any of this to Harold at first. She just started walking out past the fence line one evening with a coil of wire and 3 fence posts salvaged from the old chicken run. By the following Saturday, there were poles standing where nothing had stood before, bare gray, a little crooked, easy to mistake for something abandoned halfway through. There was a folded paper on the kitchen table that same week. Neither of them mentioned it directly, though both of them saw it every time they reached for the sugar. A notice from the bank, dated for review the following March, about the loan taken out 2 winters back, the year the hay prices dropped and the well needed a new pump in the same season, as if the farm had picked the worst possible month to ask for money twice. Harold had read it through twice before folding it back along its crease and sliding it under the bowl, where it stayed for weeks, present in every silence that didn't quite mention it. It hadn't been only the pump and the hay prices, though those were the 2 things Harold said out loud when anyone asked. There'd been a dry summer the year before that, one that had cut the second cutting of hay almost in half, and a winter after hard enough that they'd gone through feed reserves nobody had planned to touch until spring. None of it was any one person's fault. That almost made it harder to carry. A debt with no single cause behind it was a debt you couldn't argue your way out of, only work your way through, one season at a time, hoping the next one. Didn't ask for anything extra. Harold had grown up on land that had never once, in his memory, come close to changing hands. His own father had farmed through worse years than this without a bank notice ever reaching the kitchen table. It sat wrong with him in a way he hadn't found words for yet. Not fear exactly, though it had fear somewhere inside it, but something closer to the feeling of being the first one in a long line of careful men to let the ground under his feet come loose. That was the shape of that autumn in the Bennett house. Two people working the same 11 acres, carrying two different weights, neither one saying out loud the full size of what they carried. Ed Sawyer noticed the poles before he ever asked about them. He'd been driving past on his way to the feed store for 3 weeks running. Same time most mornings, same rattle in his truck bed. And on the 4th week, he finally pulled onto the shoulder, leaned out the window, and asked Alice, pleasantly enough, whether she was putting up a scarecrow that had lost its clothes. Alice told him what the poles were for. Ed nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already decided not to believe something but doesn't want to seem rude about it in front of a neighbor's wife. Well, he said, good luck teaching the owls where to sit. He laughed once, short, not unkind, and drove on toward town. Harold had been close enough to hear it, fixing a hinge on the equipment shed door 20 feet off. He didn't laugh along, but he didn't say anything in Alice's defense either. He looked down at the 10th dead tree, still lying where it had fallen 2 days before, and something in his face agreed with Ed a little more than it agreed with his own wife. Not because he thought less of her, because a man with a bank notice under his sugar bowl doesn't have much patience left over for waiting on a bird that hadn't shown up yet. That night, at the supper table, it came out in 6 words each. No more than that. That corner held for my father 20 years, Alice said, not looking up from her plate. We don't have 20 years, Alice, Harold said. We have until March. Neither voice rose. Neither word was cruel. But something in the kitchen went quiet after that in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Alice understood, more clearly than she had all week, that whatever came next in that field, she was going to be finishing it alone. She kept at it anyway. Most evenings after the supper dishes, working by the last hour of daylight with a post driver too heavy for her frame, bracing the wood against her own knee when there was no one to hold it steady, setting each pole a fraction straighter than the one before. Her palms blistered the 2nd week and calloused by the 4th. She stopped noticing the ache in her shoulders sometime around the 6th pole, the way a person stops noticing any pain that has simply become part of the evening. Harold, for his part, kept driving to the feed store for more bait, laying it along the base of the newest saplings in neat, careful rows, checking it every few days the way a man checks a bandage he isn't quite sure is working, but keeps checking anyway because doing something feels better than doing nothing. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from being the only one who believes the work is worth anything. Not the tired of hard labor. The poles weren't especially heavy. The wire wasn't especially stubborn, but the tired of standing alone in a field at dusk, listening to your own breath, with no one there to tell you it isn't foolish. Alice felt it most on the evenings Harold didn't come out at all. Evenings when the porch light stayed off and the kitchen window stayed dark until she came in herself. Hands raw, coffee long since gone cold on the fence post where she'd left it that morning and forgotten to bring back inside. There's an old habit, in people who farmed a long time, of reaching first for the fastest remedy on the shelf, even when a slower one might be more honest about what it can actually do. Maybe it isn't really about speed at all. Maybe it's that a quick cure gives you something to point to, a receipt, an empty bag, proof that you acted, while a patient one asks you to sit inside your own doubt for a while, trusting a season you can't yet see the end of. It's worth asking whether we distrust the slow answer simply because it refuses to prove itself overnight, the same way we distrust a stranger who wouldn't look us in the eye. The real test was never the storm. A storm at least gives you something to fight, something with a shape. The real test is the ordinary week after ordinary week when nothing visible changes at all, and belief has to hold up on its own weight, with no evidence yet arriving to hold it up for you. By the middle of October, there were 11 poles standing along the north and east edges of the orchard, spaced with more care than anything else on the property that season. None of them doing anything Alice could point to as proof. She checked them most mornings before the light was fully up, walking the fence line slow, coffee going cold in her hand, looking for anything at all, a feather caught in the wire, a mark in the frost, a shadow crossing overhead too fast to be a crow. Most mornings there was nothing, just 11 gray shapes standing against a gray sky, patient in a way she was starting to envy. Harold, in the evenings, sat at the kitchen table with the bait receipts spread out in front of him, running the numbers a second time, as if the total might come out smaller than it had the first time. It never did. 3 trips to the feed store since September. 2 more saplings lost in the section he'd treated himself, root-girdled the same way as all the others. The bait apparently no faster at solving the thing it was meant to solve, and considerably more expensive for the privilege of not working. He didn't say any of this to Alice. He wasn't ready to. Some numbers, once spoken aloud, become harder to walk back from. He asked around some, quietly, the way he asked about most things, a word to the man behind the counter at the feed store, another to a neighbor 2 farms over who'd had a bad rodent year himself. Both of them told him more or less the same thing, in different words. Bait worked fast at first, then slower, then not much at all, and you had to keep buying more of it to get even that. Neither man mentioned owls. Harold didn't bring them up either. It wasn't the kind of thing you said out loud in a feed store without somebody remembering it later and repeating it back to you with a grin, the same way Ed Sawyer had grinned out his truck window at Alice. Driving home that afternoon, the paper sack on the seat beside him, Harold found himself doing something he hadn't expected, counting the poles from the road as he passed the east fence line, the way you'd count anything you were trying not to seem interested in. 11 of them that week, each one a little straighter than his own 2 hands could probably have managed. He didn't slow the truck down. He didn't need to. The number was already the kind that stayed with a man past the point where he wanted it to. The middle stretch of October was the hardest part, though nothing about it looked hard from the road. No new losses on either side of the fence line for almost 2 weeks. Not on Alice's section, not on Harold's. A kind of even, uneventful quiet that told her nothing at all about which approach, if either, was working. She found herself walking the poles some mornings just to have something to check, running her hand along the cold with the way you check a fence for loose wire, though there was nothing loose to find. Twice she caught herself talking to the poles the same easy, half-serious way her father used to talk to his, and both times she stopped herself and looked around to make sure no one was close enough to hear. Harold's stretch of quiet looked different from the kitchen table. No new dead trees, but no proof his own method was the reason for it either. The same uncertainty cutting both ways, neither one of them able to claim anything yet. He caught himself rereading the same bait instructions 3 evenings running, searching for a line he might have missed the first 2 times, some reassurance printed small enough to have been overlooked. There wasn't one, just the same warning label, longer than the instructions themselves, same as it had always been. The first sign came on a Tuesday, quiet enough that Alice almost missed it entirely. A single gray-brown feather, caught low in the wire fencing beneath the tallest pole, no bigger than her thumb. She stood over it a long moment in the cold before she picked it up, turning it once in the early light, and said nothing to anyone because there was nothing yet worth saying out loud. Only something worth keeping in her coat pocket for the rest of the day, taken out and looked at twice more before supper. A hard rain came through that same week, the kind that turned the dirt road to soup and kept both of them inside for 2 full days. Alice spent part of it at the kitchen window, watching the poles lean slightly under the wind, half convinced one of them would go down before the storm passed. None of them did. When the rain finally broke, she walked out in boots too thin for the mud to check the wire on each one, and found them holding exactly where she'd set them, cold water beating off the gray wood like it had always belonged there. Ed Sawyer came by again that same week, this time with no truck window to lean out of. His own fence needed mending on the shared line, and there was no way around a short conversation while they worked it together. He didn't mention the poles directly. He did ask, almost carefully, whether the tree losses had let up any. And when Alice told him they had, on her side at least, he didn't laugh this time. He just nodded, the way a man nods at a fact he isn't ready to argue with but isn't ready to admit either, and went back to his side of the fence. 3 days after that, Harold came in from his own section of the orchard holding something in his cupped hands, walking slower than usual, his boots dragging a little in the mud by the porch steps. He set it down on the top step without a word. A small gray songbird, stiff, its feet curled tight beneath it, wings folded wrong. He'd found it near the bait line, close enough that there was no honest way to call it a coincidence, though he tried, for a moment, to call it one anyway. He didn't say anything about it that night either. He sat at the table a long while after Alice had gone up to bed, the receipts still spread out under the lamp, and then looked again at the small stiff shape he'd wrapped in a feed sack and left outside the door. He hadn't decided yet what it meant, only that it meant something, working underneath his own good intentions the same quiet way the root damage had worked underneath the soil all along. A thing you couldn't see happening until it had already happened. By the first week of November, the difference along the fence line was no longer something Alice had to go looking for. The section nearest her poles showed clean bark on every young tree still standing. No fresh girdling. No new collapses in almost 3 weeks. The section Harold had treated told a different story. 2 more losses in that same stretch, and when he finally knelt down to look closely at the bait stations himself, brushing frost off the lids, he found half of them untouched. Pellets sitting exactly where he'd left them weeks before, as if whatever had been eating his trees had simply learned, the way any living thing learns, to go around the one place that had once hurt it. He stayed kneeling there a long time on a cold, gray morning with no wind and almost no sound, just his own breath and the far-off knock of a woodpecker somewhere past the tree line. He did the arithmetic without needing the receipts spread in front of him this time. 3 trips to the feed store. 2 dead songbirds he knew of for certain. Likely more he hadn't found, tucked away in the grass where a fox or a cat had gotten to them first. Trees still lost, at nearly the same rate as before he'd started. Against all of that, 11 cedar poles that had cost him nothing but his wife's evenings, and a section of orchard that had, for the first time since June, stopped losing ground. He stayed kneeling there long enough that his knees went cold through his trousers, long enough that the woodpecker somewhere past the tree line went quiet and started up again twice. He thought about his father, who had never once in Harold's memory bought anything from a feed store that wasn't seed or fencing wire, and who would have looked at those half-empty bait stations with an expression Harold didn't especially want to imagine too closely. He thought about the bank notice folded under the sugar bowl, and about the particular kind of tire that comes from spending money on a fix that isn't fixing anything, watching the number in the drawer grow no smaller, no matter how fast you moved. And he thought, without much pride in the thought, that his wife had spent the same 11 weeks solving the same problem for the cost of some wire and 3 fence posts salvaged from a chicken run that hadn't held chickens in years. He didn't say sorry that morning. He didn't say it that week either. That wasn't how the Bennett house worked, and Alice wouldn't have known quite what to do with it if he had. An apology, spoken plainly across the supper table, would have sat strangely between them, too loud for a kitchen that had learned to say things sideways. What he did instead was quieter and, in its own way, harder. The following Saturday, instead of driving to the feed store, he walked out to the tool shed, found 3 more fence posts leaning where they'd been left since spring, and started carrying them toward his own section of the orchard without being asked by anyone. Alice saw him from the kitchen window and didn't go out right away. She let him work alone for a while first, the way he'd let her work alone through most of October. And there was something fair in that small, unspoken exchange, something neither of them would have known how to put into words even if they'd sat down and tried. By the time she did walk out to join him, the light was already going long and gold across the frost-stiffened grass. Neither of them said much of anything at all. They worked the last 2 poles in together, Harold holding the post steady this time, while Alice drove the wire through, the same task divided the opposite way it had been divided all autumn. Her hands still ached. His back still ached from bending over receipts that hadn't balanced. Neither of them mentioned either thing. The wind had picked up some by the time they set the last pole, sharp enough to redden both their faces, and when it was done, Harold stood back to look at the row the same slow, appraising way his father used to look at a finished fence. Not with praise exactly, just a kind of quiet accounting, checking that a thing had been built to last. Alice watched him do it and said nothing, recognizing the look for what it was, having seen a version of it on her own father's face more times than she could count. They walked back to the house together in the near dark, boots heavy with mud, neither one in any hurry to get there. Somewhere behind them, an owl called once, low and unhurried, and neither of them turned around to look for it. There would be time enough for that. That evening, for the first time since the notice had gone under the sugar bowl in September, Harold took it out, read it once more by lamplight, and set it in a drawer instead of putting it back where it had sat for weeks. It wasn't solved. The bank still expected what it expected in March, and 11 fence posts weren't going to change a number printed on a piece of paper. But something else had shifted between them that neither one announced out loud. A decision, made without a single argument won or lost, that the next hard season's answer wasn't going to be the fastest thing available on a store shelf, but the thing that had actually held. The owl came the following week, in the last hour of Thursday, while Alice was walking the fence line alone with her coffee already gone cold in her hand, same as every other morning that autumn. She saw it settle on the tallest pole without any drama at all. No swoop she could point to, no announcement, no sound but the small shift of wind through its wings as it folded them in. Just a shape arriving where a shape had been meant to arrive for 2 months, going still against a sky the color of ash and rust. She didn't call out to Harold. She didn't need proof from anyone else standing in that field anymore, not even him. She stood there a while longer instead, watching the bird watch the ground the way it was built to, its head turning slow, patient, unhurried by anything a bank notice or a neighbor's laugh could put a deadline on. Then she walked back toward the house in the last of the light, leaving it exactly where it had chosen to stay. By the time real winter came to Oakridge County, there were 14 poles standing along both edges of the Bennett orchard, and no one driving past on the county road bothered to ask about them anymore. Ed Sawyer still waved when he passed on his way to the feed store. He didn't laugh again, though whether that was respect or simply the cold keeping his window rolled up too tight to shout through, Alice never tried to find out. Some things don't need to be settled out loud to be settled. What lasted through that winter wasn't a single dramatic proof, the kind of moment you could point to and say that's when it worked. It was smaller than that, and slower, and in its own way more durable. A husband who no longer reached first for the fastest thing on the shelf. A wife who no longer had to drive a post into frozen ground alone at dusk. Coffee forgotten and cold on a fence post 20 yards behind her. And between them, unspoken, the particular kind of trust that doesn't arrive all at once, but accumulates the way frost does, one quiet night at a time, until one morning you look out the kitchen window and the whole field is covered in it, and you can't say exactly which night it happened, only that it did. Christmas came quiet to the Bennett house that year, quieter than most, though not in a way that felt sad. Harold gave Alice a new pair of work gloves, leather, sized right for her hands, instead of borrowed too large from his own drawer the way the old ones had always been. She didn't say much about it beyond thank you. She didn't need to. He'd noticed her hands blistering back in September and hadn't said anything then either. Noticing, in the Bennett house, had always counted for more than saying. The first real snow came the week after, soft and steady, the kind that settles rather than drifts, filling in every gap along the fence line until the 11 poles on Alice's side and the 3 new ones on Harold's looked from a distance like a single unbroken row. No one driving past on the county road could have said any more which poles belonged to whom, and it's likely neither Alice nor Harold, standing at the kitchen window some evenings with 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, could have said for certain either. The last image of that season belongs to no one in particular. Late on a December afternoon, with the light already thinning toward blue and the first real snow still a week off, the tallest cedar pole stood at the edge of the orchard exactly as it had stood since September. On top of it, without ceremony, without anyone watching to confirm it, a single owl sat facing the open field, waiting the way it always had, for whatever the dark would bring it, needing no one's permission and no one's applause to keep doing what it had always known how to do. A note on what's real in this story. Raptor perches, simple upright poles set along field edges, are a documented, low-cost method used by farmers and orchard growers to encourage hawks and owls to hunt rodents naturally. A single barn owl family can take several hundred rodents in a season, and unlike rodenticide baits, a perching bird carries no risk of secondary poisoning working its way up the food chain into songbirds, pets, or other wildlife that feed on already poisoned prey, a real and documented hazard with many bait products still sold today. Perches don't work overnight, and they aren't guaranteed to solve every rodent problem on their own. They tend to work best alongside good field sanitation, and they ask for at least one full season before their effect becomes clear. It's an old idea, more rediscovered than invented, and like most patient solutions, it asks something modern life rarely wants to give: time. Where are you watching this from tonight? And have you ever stood beside someone you loved, staying quiet, when speaking up for them would have cost you nothing at all, the way Harold did that night at the table with Alice? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. See you in the next story.